Hi, everyone, and welcome to the third episode of the International Solidarity Pod, which is a podcast that aims to explore current affairs and history relating to imperialism, the global south, gender, political economy, and people to people ties. I'm your host, Ashwin. Today, we'll be discussing how Western imperialism wages hybrid war against women in the global south, and also how this is resisted by these women in the global south. With me to talk about this are two members from the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research, Pilar Troya Fernandez and Harleen Kaur, who worked on a report for the Institute on this topic. We talk about how this hybrid warfare waged by the West essentially manufactures a situation of forced underdevelopment in these countries, particularly as it relates to social infrastructure, food security, healthcare, and care work, all of which disproportionately impact women and gender diverse communities. In addition to whichever platform you're watching or listening to this on, you can follow the work I do on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're listening to this on either Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review as it helps get this program to new listeners. All right, here's our conversation on imperialist war and feminist resistance in the global south. Okay, welcome to you both to the International Solidarity Pod. Thank you again for being here to have this very important conversation. Why don't we start by introducing ourselves? Tell us who you are, where you're based, what kind of work you do, and we can maybe start with Harleen.
Okay. Hello, everyone. My name is, as Ashwin has already told, my name is Harleen Kaur, and I'm based in the India office of Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. I have been working with the institute for last 3 years, largely as a translator. I translate the Tricon materials from English to Hindi and Punjabi, which happens to be my mother tongue as well. Lately, I've also started. Uh, Working with the editing team regarding fact checks and editing uh, the materials that we produce from Tricontinental. And yeah,
Pilar.
Hello, I am Pilar Troya Fernandez. I am Ecuadorian, but I live in Brazil. I'm an anthropologist by training, and then I study gender. But nowadays I work at Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. I'm in what we call the interregional office, who has people from all over the world, literally. And I nowadays I mostly edit Spanish, like I'm the Spanish editor. I used to translate into Spanish everything before. Now I'm doing less of that and more research.
Great, thank you. Okay, so today we'll be discussing a recent dossier from the Tricontinental Institute, just released earlier this month in March, titled Imperialist War and Feminist Resistance in the Global South. I'll leave the full report linked in the description. Um, last episode, I actually had Vijay Prashad on, and for those who don't know, he's the executive director of the Tricontinental Institute. We did get to discuss briefly hyper-imperialism. This report, starts out by noting that a key feature of hyper-imperialism today is the use of hybrid warfare against the global south, particularly using something called unilateral coercive measures, or UCMs. These are also sometimes called sanctions, but this report makes an important distinction between UCMs and sanctions. So let's start here. What do we mean by hybrid warfare? What are UCMs, unilateral coercive measures, and how are they different from sanctions? We'll start with you, Pilar.
Okay, and then Harleen can complement it, especially on the side of hybrid war. Hybrid war means a type of war that is not necessarily that does not necessarily uses regular weapons. It uses other types of weapons, and I would say sanctions or UCMs are a very important one. Also, the media is used to wage a war on people and on progressive forces, progressive left formations especially. And another feature is the use of lawfare, like not only political but judicial prosecution of all kinds of dissent. Those are, like, for me, the main things that hybrid war uses. And well, also these color revolutions are part of the hybrid war, like a way of managing the revolt of the people and like pretending there's a change when nothing is really changing with those, or it's changing for the worse. Regarding sanctions and UCMs, unilateral coercive measures. In theory, sanctions can only be applied by the UN and according to the UN Charter. There's in the UN Charter itself, or in UN documents, the word sanctions is not explicitly there, but the idea is there are some kind of punishments if states are doing things that clearly violate the UN Charter. But what happens with coercive unilateral coercive measures is that they are not applied taking into account the UN Charter. They are applied by one country against another. Usually those countries applying UCMs are the US and their allies, both in the European Union and in the global north as a whole. And the other feature of UCMs that is completely illegal is that they don't only go against one country, but also against any other country that wants to engage in relationship with the sanctioned country. So I apply a sanction against, let's say, typically Cuba, but I also try to punish any other person, company, or country that are trying to establish a relationship with Cuba, commercial relationship, cultural, political, whatever type of relationship. Sanctions, the UCMs goes against not only the country sanctioned, but third countries, and that is completely illegal. I would say those are and well, this is a very technical distinction. So normally, if you read the media or even some documents, they call sanctions everything. We wanted to make that distinction because it's very important that they are to emphasize the point that it's not a legal measure, as the US pretends, imperialist pretends. So.
Okay, I will start my point by highlighting what Pilar has just ended at. So why do we call the US sanctions or the unilateral coercive measures that the US imposes on other states as illegal is because of the fact that they see any bilateral relationship between two countries, the countries can impose sanctions on each other. But the US, what it does, as Pilar has already highlighted, is that it imposes the sanctions on other states and forces them also to follow through its sanctions, and therefore it tries to triangulate the targeted country by isolating it from the loss of trade. Otherwise, supposedly a state is not having a trade with US, it could maintain the loss of trade by trading with other countries. But now what happens is the countries, in terms of their over compliance, because of their fear of not being put under the target of the US sanctions, what they do is that they do not want to have any trade with the targeted country, and therefore the countries that face the primary sanctions, the primary unilateral coercive measures from the US, what happens is that they get isolated. And regarding the hybrid warfare, I would just like to add one more point, which is very crucial for us to understand, is that the media, the pro-Western media, what happens is that the states which are sanctioned and therefore which are isolated by the entire system of Western dominance, what happens is that the media also tries to stigmatize and not bring the reality of the implications, the human right violations imposed by the UN sanctions and imposed by the unilateral coercive measures. And it just stigmatizes the country, and therefore it seeks to legalize the otherwise illegal US measures on targeted countries.
Great, thank you. Those are very important points. Yeah, I also we'll get to this, I guess. I was very interested in the media aspect of UCMs. Well, I guess that brings me to the second question, which is, which countries are primarily the targets of UCMs? And we'll get into more specifics soon, but broadly, how are each of these countries impacted? And if you could also speak to sort of the media stigmatization of these countries, the role that plays, uh, um, that would be great. Whomever would like to start with that.
Okay.
I think Pilar, you start and then I can maybe take over.
Okay. Well, they usually go after countries that are trying to have some form of sovereignty, like being in charge and managing their own resources. So Western companies won't have a chance to loot them as they always do. Those are the countries, and the countries that have governments that are clearly anti-imperialist. They want to keep the Western dominance through mechanisms as debt, unfair trade rules, and the control of resources, basically. Like, I don't know if you probably don't remember, but there was a coup in Bolivia in 2019. Bolivia has a very left-wing government, even now. And one thing they did back then is nationalize lithium. Lithium is key for electric batteries that are very important right now, as we know. So back then, the coup failed after a year, and democracy returned. There were elections. Now they again have a progressive government. But right after the coup, Elon Musk, who of course has great interest in lithium because of his company, he said literally, we do coups wherever we want. Like, that's the key part to understand. The country that has been most sanctioned is Cuba. Cuba never speaks about sanctions or UCMs. They call it blockade, and they want to be the process to be called blockade in every language, because in English usually they say embargo, but it's a full blockade because they are prohibited from doing basically everything. There's like, they cannot have access to resources, to trade, to anything. The idea is to like make the country suffer in economical terms so they can allow a change of regime. Yeah. So if one of the main objectives of sanctions is maintaining Western dominance, the second one is always changing the regime. So it's allowing room for the imperialist Western companies to make business and then having a regime that protects them. That's imperialist colonialism, maintaining it. And the countries that are most sanctioned are Cuba, North Korea, about which there is very little information. Sadly, that's why it's not on the dossier. Probably much more is written in their own language or that we couldn't access. Iran, Venezuela, and Syria until recently. Right now, they are way less sanctioned, because they have a regime that is or looks like to be pro-US.
So I will start by, how is US and its ally, why are they able to basically maintain such kind of embargo, such kind of blockade or isolation? It is because of the fact that US is the center of the international financial system. It is through its power of dollar, through its veto power in the IMF or whatever, it has the central position and it has the deciding factor, because of which it tries to, and it is enabled by all these factors to isolate the countries that it wants to for its own benefits. And as rightly as Pilar has just mentioned, the entire objective of these blockades is, if we look at the UN definition, it is to basically it is to, compel a change of policy in another state. So it is basically a enforced policy, so that there is a policy change, and as Pilar has mentioned, there is a regime change, as we have recently seen in Syria. And as we look at the economic, impact of the UCMs, what we see is, even if we just talk about the GDP, there has been a substantial impact on the GDP of the countries that have been targeted by the UCMs from US, be it Cuba, be it Iran, be it Venezuela, be it Syria. Even before, now we have a pro-Western government in Syria, but just one statistic can define you the kind of, loss a country, goes through because of these UCMs. In 2010, a year before UCMs were imposed, the GDP in Syria was $252 billion. And in 2020, it had fallen to $11 billion. So there was this huge downfall. And I'm just mentioning about one country. The same is the case with Cuba, Iran, Venezuela, where production in productive sectors, be it oil, be it mining, be it manufacturing sector, they go down, and therefore they bring down your ability to export, and therefore they bring down your ability also to import. And that is the larger, even if we do not speak about all the numbers.
That's great. Yeah, so maybe just to reiterate, I mean, these are often, sovereignty-seeking countries that in the face of that, the West responds with a kind of enforced underdevelopment, and this is a word that is used in the report, forced underdevelopment through UCMs, through unilateral coercive measures, um, to encourage a regime change, and have a new regime that is friendly to the West, and that the West can access, right? So that the West can access these countries' labor, this resources, etc., value essentially. Um, does anyone want to talk a little bit more about the media side of things and how these countries get vilified, and particularly their forms of underdevelopment, gets vilified, uh, uh, and sort of the narrative is turned around. I think of Cuba, for example, how the levels of underdevelopment imposed by the West is attributed to its own, something that is just innate to Cuba's system. And this is obviously the case with other countries as well. Large media campaigns against Iran, etc. And obviously, that's not to say that there aren't issues either. But yeah, if anyone wants to speak to this, this is quite an important aspect. Pilar?
Okay, well, I'm not an expert, but like it's important also to understand that the media is highly controlled by Western corporations. So mainstream media gets some messages that they know they have to emphasize, and some other voices that they won't listen at all. So that is a big part of the thing. And I would say right now, social media, it's allows all kind of fake news to circulate, and that's what they use a lot. At least, again, I'm not really an expert on media, but at least in Latin America, they use that a lot. And in recent years, basically against Venezuela, I would say, more than Cuba, because Cuba is like an old story, and they say it's always been the same. They don't speak about all the good things, like no children is ever sleeping on the streets in Cuba, or they have the best health system of the whole region, and probably the best education system as well. They would never talk about that. They would only say, yeah, they are poor because they are corrupted. And fake news like that Chavez or Fidel stole huge amounts of money without any proof. They just keep circulating those kind of things. And with social media, that's even easier. And there's like a pattern, like established type of discourse for all big media outlets. So they call, for instance, the words in Spanish or in Portuguese, not necessarily regime means a non-democratic government, as is the case in English. But you see, in English, they always call it regime. It's not a government. So the US has administration, some other countries have governments, but Venezuela has a regime. And they create those ideas like the evil axis, the axis of evil. I don't remember well the name that they made up. So all those countries are part of a evil axis trying to do, it's not clear what. So I would say those are the main aspects from my point of view on how the media and the social media is part of this process.
That's great. Anything to add to that, Harleen?
I think Pilar has said enough about it.
That's good. Okay. Maybe I'll toss the next one to you, Harleen, and then we can come back to Pilar. So what makes women then, and women and gender diverse communities particularly vulnerable to UCMs? And this is essentially what the report is about.
So yeah, as we have already spoken about the broader, the macro level, economic impacts of unilateral coercive measures. So what happens is, because there is a decline in the entire, the revenues of the government are declining. Therefore, the maintenance of social infrastructure, the maintenance of, for example, healthcare, the maintenance of education system, the maintenance of electricity system, the maintenance of water system, the maintenance of food production at the country level, it also deteriorates because of the decrease in government's capability to access whatever equipments are required to maintain these facilities, to access the financial systems that are required to maintain these facilities, or to purchase the equipments that are required for these facilities. So what happens is that there is a shortage of food, there is a shortage of essential medicines, there is a shortage of essential healthcare system, there is a shortage of electricity, and all these, when the social infrastructure collapses, the gender division of our societies has not undergone a very severe change. All the burden of these collapses falls on the shoulder of women, because when there is a lack of health, when there is a health crisis, women are the first ones to, look after the families. When there is water crisis, they go miles and miles to fetch water. When there is food crisis, as the report has also mentioned by a women from Venezuela, that they have to stand in queues for hours and hours to get food, because there is no, the usual supply of food has decreased. And this basically impacts it increases the unpaid labor that they do, that they otherwise were doing. And it also impacts their participation in the political sphere. It also impacts when the economic structure is changing, it also impacts them economically. We have seen companies undergoing layoffs, companies being closed. And when all this happens, women are also, impacted in terms of the economic capacity of their survival, and also in terms of the increase of unpaid labor on them.
Thank you, Harleen. Pilar, anything to add to that?
I mean, no, in general, I think we can go over in more detail when we speak about different sections.
Yeah, that's great. Yes. So I guess broadly then, what Harleen is, was just talking about was that there's a sort of targeting of the sphere of social reproduction, essentially, what is necessary to reproduce life. And a lot of that sphere of social reproduction anyway happens to, fall to women under the patriarchal setup, across different contexts. And when there's sort of a breakdown in the overall structure brought about by these UCMs, you see sort of an intensification of that. Okay, so we are going to perhaps move on to getting more specific into, the different areas that that are impacted by UCMs. But before that, I sort of just wanted to I wanted to ask, this is a very well put together document. There's data and anecdotes and analysis from all over the global south. So I would encourage listeners, the audience, to actually go and read this report. There's a lot more detail that obviously we're unable to get into over a conversation. There's statistics, etc. I wanted to ask if you could briefly tell us what was the process of conducting this research by Tricontinental, because this is really important work.
Okay, so as the report has already mentioned briefly about how the process began and how we basically went through it. So in 2023, we had a conference called the Dilemmas of Humanity, where organizations, people's organizations from across global south and across countries, they came together to discuss what are the dilemmas of our time. How do we maintain our struggles? What are the challenges that we face in our struggles? Be it the struggle against patriarchy, be it the struggle for education, for health system, for ecology, for a better ecology, and all these points were discussed. And some of us were taking notes and also conducting the seminars. And one of the interesting points that were highlighted in the seminar on feminism and struggles against patriarchy was the fact of the gendered impact of economic sanctions, the gendered impact of unilateral coercive measures. And this was a very interesting point for us to investigate, because women from Venezuela, women from Iran, women from Palestine also, their experiences of were basically, if we collate all those experiences, they were speaking of the same thing, which is the imperialist war against, women. It's an economic war, but it has a very gendered impact on women. So we wanted to go on this. And so the process has been to engage with dialogues with women organizers in these countries which have been impacted by UCMs, and also to look at the reports. Largely, we have looked at the reports which have been produced by the UN Special Rapporteur on negative impacts of the UCMs, Elena, we have looked at all those reports. The data largely comes from these such reports, and the anecdotes, they come from the women and the people that we have spoken to.
Pilar, anything to add?
Nothing but the fact that it is hard to reach out to those women because also the impact of UCMs, like they have electricity outages, they have difficulties to meet because they have no time. They have their amount of work, especially care work, is huge because of the sanctions. So that is interesting how also impacts on that side.
Great. Okay. So the report outlines, the several areas impacted by the UCMs, including there are four, listed in the report. First is food security, second, social infrastructure, third, healthcare, and fourth, care work. Um, Walk us through each of these and how women and gender diverse populations are impacted by them. I think we'll try to go one by one. In terms of food security, what does this look like?
Okay, maybe we can divide in one. I keep switching. Okay, so what happens mainly is that food production is impacted. Why? Because you cannot import, let's say, pieces to repair machinery or new machinery. So production decreases, or you cannot import fertilizers because of the UCMs. So food decreases. Then importing is also difficult. So if you don't produce food, all the food that you need, which what happens a lot in Venezuela and Cuba, Iran is a bit better in that sense, for instance. So they suffer because of that. They say in Cuba, for instance, they say that in 2024, they had to pay 76% more for the food they used to import in 2019 before the pandemic. So with the same amount of money, they can buy a lot less. So the population doesn't have access to food. And like the reduction of the agricultural production is from anywhere from 40 to 80% in some of those countries, especially in Cuba. And there's also lack of investment in the sector. For instance, if there were foreign companies producing some food there, like typically export crops, they stopped doing that because of the sanctions. And all the countries report an increase in food. All the sanctioned countries report that increases in food insecurity, undernourishment, infant malnutrition. One of the main programs in Venezuela is distribution of food. Main government schemes is the distribution of food. That also, we can talk later about, that helps to create stronger communities and is a place where women organize a lot.
I would just like to highlight before I begin with, talking about the other aspect that we have maintained, that when we say that there is an impact in the food on food security, or there is an impact on health structure, or there is an impact on social infrastructure, these are not actually sectors which are isolated from each other. As Pilar has rightly mentioned, when there is a food shortage, what happens is that people are malnourished, people are undernourished, women who are pregnant, they are also undernourished. And therefore, there is an increased need of healthcare, actually. But at the same time, the healthcare system is also deteriorating because of the impact of UCMs. And what happens is that what we have observed through the reports is that the availability of essential medications, it's very low. For example, 50% essential medicines are unavailable in Venezuela. Zimbabwe, for example, is that relies for essential medications on import. 70% of its essential medication come from import. So when your import capacity is hampered, you're basically, so these are basically, they feed into each other. You are undernourished, and you are also not having a proper access to medical system, to proper medications. When there is loss of water, there is a lack of access to water or clean water. You have increased rate of epidemics like cholera, like typhoid fever, which we have seen in Zimbabwe. So these basically systems feed into each other, and it becomes really very difficult for the governments to maintain the care of people through its various sections. Yeah.
Great. Yeah, that's actually a very important point because, I mean, even as I read through the report, it's clear that, trade, machinery, what you're able to fuel, what you're able to get into the country. I mean, these span across sectors, right? And then problems created in one sector um, would help if you had healthcare in to back that up in the other sector, but all sectors essentially are undermined together. Um, okay, I want to talk a little bit about social infrastructure in terms of we touched on this a little bit, water and energy. Harleen, do you want to take that?
Yeah. Okay. So I'll speak about, for example, Venezuela. In the report that was produced by the UN Special Report here, in 2021, only 50% of the water distribution system, the services for water distribution, they were actually functional. Why? Because there is a import bans, that you cannot access the essential equipments which are required for maintaining these services. And yeah, so this is what happens in across countries. There's lack of water, there's lack of electricity. For example, in Cuba in 2019, if I'm not wrong, according to the data, uh, almost 50% of the country was unable to access electricity. So these are the kinds of and we are talking about it in 21st century. These are basic requirements for any human development, for your day to day functionality. When you do not have access to electricity, and when you do not have access to water, you also do not have access to many other things. Your access to education, it gets impacted when there is a lack of water. Your access to sanitation gets impacted when there is a lack of water. So everything gets impacted.
Just a point that is useful for all areas is the fact that the technology they need for making all those systems work, like water systems, sanitation, sewage in general, whatever, comes mostly from the West. So if there are sanctions, it's not that they can reach out to easily to global South countries to fix the issue, because the machinery, the technology, everything comes from Western countries. Because we need to remember always that they want people to rebel and overthrow the government, or the government to fall because it can no longer function. That's the objective of sanctions. It's not like moralizing, as the media also sometimes wants to pretend that they are moralizing a corrupt regime. No, they want to overthrow it and get a one that is more favorable to the West.
Yeah, and perhaps one thing that I'll highlight from the report on this is that, for example, in Venezuela, the report talks about how the water distribution systems are reliant on or have been established essentially with technology from Germany and Switzerland. And, once UCMs are applied, then in terms of maintenance or replacement, once you have these systems that are, uh, uh, whose tech has essentially been monopolized by the West, and then you're cut off from the rest of the world. And in a sense, there's a conspiracy against you, and you're cut off from being able to access that, then your whole water distribution system gets impacted negatively. Okay, let's talk about health. Yes, Harleen, go ahead.
May I just add one more point to it? See, when we are talking about, the impact of it, it's not just the materials that are required to maintain the social infrastructure. It is also the human resources that are required. So when the wages deteriorate, when people are, laid off, when the government is unable to hire people or to maintain the wages, it also impacts the availability of the human power that is essential for maintaining the services. And as the report highlights, there is a severe shortage of people working in the systems. There are huge levels of vacancies that are there in the social sectors, be it healthcare, be it so that also needs to be highlighted.
Very important point. Um, yeah, I mean, it is essentially a conspiracy of de-development, in a sense. Okay, I did want to talk about healthcare. Pilar, did you want to take that one?
Uh-huh. It was not that easy to find information that is like, I would say, kind of even, like the same type of data for different countries as it was in other sections. But nonetheless, it's easy to regard some issues clearly. For instance, if there is no equipment for making tests, then people won't get tested. And that has impact in all areas. Cuba produces their own medicine, but don't have like basic things to produce them, both in terms of raw materials and machinery. At some point during the COVID pandemic, they already have like several vaccines in development. They vaccine their population with their own vaccines, but they were out of syringes. There was a campaign to send syringes to Cuba. So it's not that their health system is bad. It's not that they don't have trained people. They do have all of that, but they cannot work properly because they don't have the basic materials to produce many stuff. In all the countries, one thing that is similar is like medication and equipment for rare disease is always Western technology. So that's one of the areas that gets an immediate impact because they have no longer the money or the access to those medicines, the equipment that can help people with rare disease. In terms of reproductive health, that is, of course, a higher impact on women and also sexually diverse populations. There is lack of access to pap tests, for instance, and then it's difficult to detect cervical cancer, but there's also difficulty for mastectomies, so checking for breast cancer. The mortality rates in countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe started rising again because the tendency was to be reduced for many years. I would say maternal mortality rate has been reducing in most countries for the last probably 60 years. But after the onset of the UCMs, in both Venezuela and Zimbabwe, the data shows how maternal mortality increased, and reversing the tendency took years in the case of Venezuela. Zimbabwe, it seems it hasn't managed to do so yet. Again, Cuba, that has a free and universal healthcare system, a good one, that people from other countries go there to for surgeries and treatments and wherever. They couldn't import not only syringe but also ventilators during COVID because of the sanctions. Iran used to produce most of their medication and basic vaccines, like 95% before the sanctions. Right now, it's not so the case. Let me remove, I think those are the main things that we managed to, besides saying again that if you get a food impact, then you had all types of health impacts because of lack of proper nutrition.
Yeah, and even on sort of, the blockade on Cuba has deteriorated or has withdrawn supports in the healthcare system, but that's also resulted in Cuba developing a very resilient and high quality healthcare system infrastructure, but that is obviously still impacted by imperialism. This also reminds me of how recently in the news, Cuban medical missions across the rest of the Caribbean have been um, attempted to be compromised by the U.S. The U.S. has been attempting to target other countries in the Caribbean. I think of Barbados, for example, even Trinidad and Tobago. The claims from the West are that these Cuban medical missions are some form of forced labor and support to the the Cuban regime is the language being used, and the leaders of these countries in the rest of the Caribbean, Barbados, Trinidad and Tobago, are being threatened by the U.S. With revocation of their U.S. visas, so they would, these politicians would not be able to travel to the U.S. anymore. And a lot of them are saying, I mean, I did see Prime Minister Mia Mottley from Barbados saying, I'm ready to give that up because Cuban medical missions are essential in the region. Yeah. The other thing is that a lot of these descriptions of the fallout or the impact of UCMs across the global south and across the countries we mentioned, Cuba, Venezuela, Iran, Zimbabwe, are really, in a lot of ways, slow motion versions of what we are seeing in Palestine and in Gaza in particular. I mean, a lot of the same issues, right? Access to water. That's Israel cut off, water supply and the water systems in general, food, etc. All of these are hyper accelerated in in the current stage of this genocide in Gaza. But reading through this report, I mean, it is obvious in some ways, but it really did strike me how this is a slow motion version of that stretched out over time with much less media attention and thus requiring a level of resilience as well to be developed among the populations there. Okay, let's talk about care work then. Perhaps, Harleen, I'll pass this to you.
Okay, I have already briefly mentioned about how all this deterioration in the social infrastructure leads to an increase in the unpaid care work, be it in terms of the walking to get water, clean water, or queuing up to get food, or looking after the sick family members. I would just like to add one or two more points to it, probably. One is that we also need to understand that many families are single parent families, particularly which are run by the women. They also get affected in a way, because women are the sole earners, and they are also the sole they are looking after all the duties, so there is no one to share the burden with them. And one more thing which the report slightly mentions is the change in the demographics that we see, because of people are trying to migrate because of the changes in the livelihood changes that are happening in their countries. And this migration has also sort of shifted the burden of work on women, and also the women who are migrating, the gender diverse people who are migrating, they also suffer from a from various sorts of assaults, and they are forced to work as untrained, unskilled labor in the countries that they go to, and they undergo all sorts of assault um, when they migrate. So the demographics is also changing, and the report briefly mentions about this.
Great. Pilar, did you have anything to add to that? Okay. Okay. So, and I think this is probably the most important, part of the discussion, uh, is, how have women and gender diverse populations across these countries in the global south targeted by UCMs? How have they been conducting social organizing and resistance against these conditions brought about by imperialism or hyper imperialism? Pilar, if you want to start.
Okay, first, let me say that we have very, very little information on gender diverse population. So I wouldn't be able to say much about that because we are relying on reports already written for data and so on. And we didn't really conduct interviews with gender diverse people. So we don't have information on that specifically, besides a few things on reproductive health. But for women at the grassroots level, they became a safety net for their communities. They provide collective solutions. Again, the example of Venezuela is very interesting because the government created that food distribution program called CLAP, that's the name in Spanish, and they want to avoid the private distribution networks. So if the government is importing food, that the food reaches directly to the people without a private company as a broker. And so that mechanism, they also created by the state was created including community participation. So, and the women became key for that process because they were in charge of like a fair distribution with popular oversight and delivering directly to the households. It's like, I don't know if we put the data there, but it's like almost 90% of those local distribution systems are run by women. And of course, that adds to the burden of care work again, but at the same time helps empower women. So it's a bit contradictory, but at the end, it has had good impacts on the empowerment of women at the grassroots level and in the strengthening of the people's movements that are resisting imperialism. There are also programs for food production. Like all those countries have had to increase their own food security. I mean, the ability to produce the food they consume, because the difficulties for importing, and then of course agriculture gets affected because what we said before, but even though they have improved their capacity of producing food on their own. And there are also initiatives regarding like education, both in terms of training and like agroecology schools, or training for other technical like type of work. There are also around the house building like houses. There are programs created in Venezuela that women organize for getting access to houses that they didn't have before. The issue here maybe again is that they gain visibility at the grassroots level, they gain power in their communities. They also, I was forgetting in terms of health issues, they would trying to improve the nutrition of the people, to improve healthcare, organizing aid from other countries, like having visits or medicines from other countries for helping communities. That's also was organized by women, but all that things they did at that level didn't necessarily reflect on them gaining more power at like political institutional level. It's not that they became like, for instance, have more chance of being candidates in an election for the local governments, or they have more positions in the government or anything like that. Women are still overrepresented in informal labor markets and are still the first ones to be fired. So it's not that the situation has changed that much, but women have been key for making the impact of sanctions of UCMs less hard on the population. Without them, the population certainly would suffer much more.
I will just add one more thing. So when we were, discussing the reports and the findings and whatever discussions we had, women organizers, one thing which kept on, in our discussions was that, the aspect of how do we put it? We were asking this question amongst ourselves. So how do we put up, how do we phrase it? That their participation in solidarity efforts, in collective efforts to bring food on tables, to in such community level efforts, how do we put it politically? And one conclusion which is important to draw, and which we also highlight in the report, is that, as Pilar has also mentioned, that women are active. They have become the absorbers of the shocks that UCMs are giving, the primary absorbers, because of which the societies have been able to survive, but their participation has not resulted into critical representation, and it must also be seen not as a romanticization of the essentiality of care work, but as something which reinforces the gender dimension of care work, and the works, the division of work, how it is gendered, and it imposes the gender dimensions, reimposes them.
Yeah, that's right. And yeah, because I paid attention to that aspect of things too, right? Because on the one side, um, and I think this is sort of maybe because of sort of the Western discourse on feminism, right? There is perhaps a tendency to maybe over romanticize this, uh, without sufficiently acknowledging that these struggles and these forms of social organizing are largely a product of circumstance and a product of being forced into this position. It is not easy to say the least. Uh, on the other hand, though, returning back to how we started, this is these are essentially punishments for seeking sovereignty, and in that way, this kind of social organizing and resistance is also a reassertion of sovereignty in a way, again, without romanticizing it and acknowledging simultaneously that this really is a product of circumstance and a product of aggression, imperialist aggression from the West. Um, okay, second last question, I guess. I was curious. And as we've talked about, the report discusses how social reproduction is attacked by imperialism. Women are on the front lines. Um, in your research, how have and we talk about that sort of by default, the disproportionate burden falls on women. But in this research, how have you found men to be responding to this? Is there a greater socialization of the burden over time, or does this structure sort of stay this kind of way? That was sort of what I was curious about. If there was any thoughts on that, yeah.
Well, we don't really dwell much into that, but for me, it seems the changes are happening slowly in a more general way, not specifically because of UCMs. Like, there are changes that are in place in different countries for different reasons. Like, for instance, Cuba, because of being a socialist country for 60 years, there are things that have been already different for many years. But we don't see that because of UCMs, things change in that sense, like less patriarchy, on the contrary. Like, and if there are changes they have to do more with a more general evolution of things. Like right now, it's not so accepted to say that men shouldn't do any care work. It's not, but in a general way. But we didn't interview men in that about this either. So, but no women reported in any conversation, in any interview, like men were helping more, it was easier, or anything like that. And several of them are single mothers, which is frequent in poor communities, at least in Latin America.
Okay. Um, let's close out here. Maybe I'll ask each of you, what is the bottom line of this report? Perhaps what do you um yourselves take away as the bottom line, and what should people pay attention to from this report? We can start with Harleen.
Can I start from my own, positionality? I have been living in India, which I can say is not directly impacted as the countries that we talk about in the dossier. So the most interesting part for me to engage with this question was to really understand what happens when such sanctions are imposed on you. Because even if you are part of a struggle, a feminist struggle, but your positionality changes the kinds of the kinds of questions or the kinds of real problems that you face. So my interest was truly to understand and to read in depth and to converse with the people who are firsthand experiencing these impositions, and from their experiences try to understand how large the feminist struggle in itself is, and how it also brings to you that feminist struggle, it's not just against patriarchy, it is also anti-imperialist. And for you to be a feminist in a country which is not directly facing sanctions, you have to actually support all those struggles. and you have to speak about them.
Yeah, I would say that in general, people don't understand what happens in sanctions. Okay, it's like they don't get it, that it's we call it a type of war because it ends up killing people, not directly with the bullets, but sanctions kill people in general. I think that is very important to be said. And the increase of sanctions in the last years has been huge. It's also in the report. Over 930% more sanctions. And the US is the winner, of course, imposing over 5,000 sanctions right now. And that is not generally well known, and less so the impact that it has on more vulnerable population. It's women basically, but also indigenous people, racialized people, disabled people, children gets more impacted by those measures that seem to be directed against governments and evil regimes, but in fact they are directed against the population. I mean, and that has to be more disseminated. People need to know more about that. And the fact that in those conditions, who are like reacting, who are doing something, or who are doing more to help, are always women, as usually happens. But that is like a bit of a repetition, because I remember a long time ago when we were studying the impacts of neoliberal policies, was the same thing, because you get neoliberal policies, you get less funding for schools, so women will help cleaning the school or painting the school because the government has no more funds. So now we have those impacts in some places, and in the countries that are trying not to do that, not to apply neoliberal policies, then you get sanctions. And the result for women is similar, but even worse. They have to take care of what the governments cannot do, and that needs to be seen, I think.
Great, thank you for that. Um, one of the bottom lines, I guess, for me was that very often, and this speaks to sort of the media hegemony of the West, and the dominance of the West in knowledge production, right? The West gets away with being able to claim feminist credentials and progress on women's issues, etc. I mean, even in the global South, I mean, Harleen, I mean, I can relate with Harleen because, you know, I'm also Indian, right? And there's this tendency in South Asia and the subcontinent to, at least maybe on a superficial level, to see the West as more progressive on women's issues, etc. But I mean, the bottom line for me from this report is sort of blows through that lie in a lot of ways, and how the West is defined by imperialism, and imperialism wages war against women and gender diverse communities in the global South, and I think that's something that folks should take away from this. Okay, that's great. I think we can leave it at this for now. I'd like to say thank you to you both for joining us for this important conversation. Before you go, can you let the audience know where you can find your work? Maybe I'll give it to Pilar first.
Yes, thank you, Ashwin, for this podcast. It was very interesting and to be here. Very nice to have this conversation. You can find our material at tricontinental.org. Sorry. We produce in three main languages, English, Spanish, and Portuguese, but we also produce a lot of stuff in other languages as Hindi, Italian, French, not everything, but a few things. We have quite a bit of material on what we may call popular feminism, not only this dossier, but several other dossier newsletters. In fact, this week newsletter is about the dossier. It's called Imperialist and the War on Women, Imperialist Wars on Women, something like that. I'm forgetting right now the exact title. But there you can find like a bit of a summary of the dossier and uh, more information. Yeah, it's UCMs and the War on Women. That's the title. We have studies of feminist women from different parts of the world in a feminist studies series. And we have also lots of materials on issues like relevant for the global south, issues relevant for the people's movement. That's what we produce from a radical left perspective.
Harleen.
Thank you for having us, Ashwin. We are really grateful that you organized this discussion. Our works can be found, as Pilar has already said, on the tricontinental.org. I would just like to mention one more thing. There are many things that we as youth are struggling with today, be it struggle, be it being, not in education, not in employment, not in training. We are people who have different sorts of questions, and the media right now is neglecting all our relevant and essential questions. And if you want to have an understanding of all such queries, you can visit the tricontinental.org and have an understanding from people's perspective, from the perspective of global south, on relevant questions of our time, and also to understand the historical progress. We have all relevant materials for you.
That's great. And I'll echo that, the Tricontinental does, fabulous work. I mean, even some of these other reports that I've gone through are just great work. Also, I should emphasize that even this dossier on imperialist war and feminist resistance in the global south has a lot of great artwork done by women from around the world, and that's something I also really appreciate about the Tricontinental's work. Like there's a real integration of art as well. It's great. So I would encourage as sort of the last word, listeners, the audience to go and check out this report, this dossier, as well as the other work that the Tricontinental Institute does. And I will leave those in the description as well. Okay, once again, thank you both very much. I really do appreciate it. That was our conversation with Pilar and Harleen. I've left links in the description to the report and also to the Tricontinental's website. And once again, you can follow us on Instagram at Journal of INTL Solidarity and on Substack at intlsolidarity.substack.com. If you're watching this on YouTube, please like and subscribe. If you're listening to this on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, please leave a review. Otherwise, reach out to us to let us know your feedback and thoughts. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.